Well, hey guys, Jason Wheeler here, one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, bringing your life group DVD lesson video to you again for the week. And we are, as I'm sure you're still aware, in our Authentic series yet again. So this is week 37 of our Authentic series. And Authentic, again, just a study of authentic Christianity. Very important that we get a hold of what Christianity really looks like from the Bible instead of just whatever some people in the world are saying, right? So that's what we've been doing. And our key verses this week, this is a little bit different, the way we're going to do this week. Our key verses are still from 1 John chapter 4, verses 13 through 21. But this week, I'm going to read specifically 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. And then I'm going to read Proverbs 7:1. And you guys see that you have that on your outline. If you were here for the message, and you should have been, if you haven't been, you should go check that message out as soon as you can. You'll know that we talked a lot about Proverbs 7:1 as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read those two verses, and then I'll tell you why I did that, and then we will get into the discussion questions. So 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love." And then Proverbs 7:1 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." And as Pastor Lynn told us on Sunday, it is vitally important that we get a hold of the fear of the Lord. And it is very clear in our culture today, at least, that we have, to a large extent, culturally, lost the fear of the Lord. Now, the question, when you read those two verses side by side, that comes up then is, how do you reconcile there's no fear in love, but the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? That's the question that Pastor Lynn posed. That's the question that Pastor Lynn answered. And, just to go back again to the message, he talked about two different types of fear, a good fear and a bad fear. There's the first type of fear, the kind of fear that you ought to have, but you don't naturally have unless God gives it to you. And that would be the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of knowledge. And remember that knowledge in that verse means knowing God, having a relationship with Him, knowing His character. And then there's the second type of fear, which is the kind of fear that you ought not to have, but you naturally do have it, unless it's replaced with God's love. So that would be the sort of fear that we're talking about in 1 John 4, verse 18. But I think it's so important that we get a hold of the fear of the Lord. And it's not something that people talk about a lot. And it's great it's necessary that is where we started when we're talking about the fear. So you'll remember that Pastor Lynn talked about four different types of fear. He talked about the fear that is commencement. There's no beginning with God without this fear. He talked about fear that is condemned. That fear that is commencement is a good fear. Fear that is condemned being a fear because you don't understand God's message. And the example that we had of that was from Luke 2, where the shepherds are terrified of the angels because they're not understanding the angel's message until the angels explain it to them. And then Pastor Lynn talked about the fear that is convicting, which is a good fear. This fear convicts us when we're about to go in the wrong direction. And the fear then that is cast out, which is the terror of Judgment Day. That would be a bad fear. So he talked in depth about those fears. So what we're going to do now is kind of try to relate those to ourselves personally. So we will jump into our discussion questions at this point. Question 1. Remember that the fear that is commencement, which is the beginning of our relationship with God, the beginning of our knowledge of God. There is no beginning with God without this fear. And it comes with a knowledge of the peril that we are in before salvation. Briefly, I remember when I believed that I was saved, understanding that I was in the same boat as everybody else as far as eternity in hell, consequences of my actions were concerned. Up to that point, I'd kind of lived my life with this foundational belief that whether I recognized it or not, that I don't know, that I was kind of special and that God was okay with the silly things that I was doing because I considered myself a decent person or something. And it hit me when I was saved how wrong that was and how perilous the situation that I was in was. So, for question 1, can you describe coming to know the peril that you were in before salvation? How did that hit you? Did that hit you? Does that still need to hit you? Pray about this and talk about it now. Okay, hopefully there was some good conversation there. For question 2, the question is, do you have a fear of displeasing God? And you'll remember the example that Pastor Lynn used, and it's the same example I would have for my own life, is the fear of displeasing my own father. My father, my worldly father, my dad, was a nice guy, a fun guy. I was never, ever, ever worried about him, physically punishing me, or I wasn't scared of the man. At the same time, I was desperate to please him. I wanted his approval. I had a desperate desire not to displease my dad. And that has carried over into my relationship with God then at this point. So the question is, do you have a fear of displeasing God? Discuss that, and then maybe discuss why or why not. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, for question 3 here, we're going to talk about convicting fear. And you'll remember that Pastor Lynn gave 3 great examples of convicting fear. He talked about a convicting fear coming upon us from the Holy Spirit when we would obey men rather than God. He talked about a convicting fear coming from the Holy Spirit coming upon us when we would not be His witness, when we might be afraid to do that. And he talked about convicting fear coming upon us when we might become lax in our sanctification, when we would just become complacent, not step into or out of the things that we ought. So, with those things kind of in mind, this is a two-parter here. Can you describe a time that you listened to a good convicting fear? When your flesh, your strongholds wanted to do one thing, and the Holy Spirit convicted you to face the discomfort or the consequences, the reality of whatever might happen by listening to His convicting fear. Can you describe a time that you listened to a good convicting fear? What did that look like? What came of it? Maybe you saw God's hand at work at the time. Maybe you saw it later on. Just go ahead and talk about that a bit with your group. And then discuss a time that you did not listen to the convicting fear, and maybe how that worked out. What sort of consequences or redirection maybe came as a result of that. So a time that you did listen to convicting fear, a time that you did not. Go ahead and talk about that now. Okay. I know, all kinds of personal questions today. So for question 4, Pastor Lynn talked about the fear that is cast out. And those are the words that are used specifically in 1 John 4, verse 18. There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And the way that Pastor Lynn described that was the terror of Judgment Day. And not that it's not something that doesn't, from time to time, give us pause, require prayer, but the Holy Spirit in the heart of a believer should cast out the terror of that day. So the question then is, has the fear or the terror of Judgment Day been cast out for you? What's in your heart when that subject comes up in it? Be willing to listen to the Holy Spirit here. Be willing to be honest and talk about that. Okay, and so for question 5 here, takeaway question. Considering everything you've talked about today, considering all the answers to these personal questions, what do your answers to these questions about the fear of God in your life mean? And what can you apply from today's group? I'll say that again, and the word mean is not on your outline. It should be, but here's the question. What do the answers to these questions that you have answered today about the fear of God in your life mean? What do they point to? What are they evidence of as far as your relationship with God is concerned, or anything else? And then what can you apply from today's group to aid in your own sanctification? That's it for this week, guys. I hope it's been a good group for you, and I will be back with you next week.